Welcome to the captivating realm of science fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our exciting new stories. Enjoy the journey.
Through the cold, sterile halls of the alien citadel, Niara walked as though each step were her last. Her heart pounded louder with every passing moment, an unwelcome reminder of her duty. The ritual was near, and the weight of expectation rested on her slender shoulders. She had been chosen, not by desire, not by will, but by necessity. The grand rites demanded it, a ceremonial binding between human males and her kind, the Ziri, to secure the future of their species. Yet the thought of a human male, one of those strange creatures with violent pasts and primitive instincts, sickened her. She had seen them in holographic records, had witnessed their wars and savagery. How could such a creature be worthy of this sacred role? Niara's long, iridescent hair, a shimmering cascade of blues and silvers, framed her sharp, angular face, accentuating the cold determination in her violet eyes. Her body, lean and sinewy, moved with a feline grace, though each movement now felt deliberate and controlled, as though each muscle could betray her reluctance. She wore the ceremonial robe of her station, flowing white silk that clung to her like a second skin, yet it felt like a cage, trapping her in a fate she hadn't chosen. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of metal doors sliding open. A pair of guards stood at the entrance to the chamber of binding, their helmets obscuring any emotion as they acknowledged her with a nod. Her time had come. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense and the low hum of ancient machinery. In the center of the chamber stood the binding altar, a platform surrounded by shimmering crystals that pulsed with a dull light, responding to the energy within the room. The high priestess, in long white robes that nearly blended into the floor, waited silently, her presence commanding though her face remained unreadable beneath a deep hood. Niara's gaze shifted to the far side of the chamber, where the humans stood. At first, she felt nothing but disgust. The soldier was tall, his broad shoulders encased in a military uniform worn and weathered from countless battles. His face was rugged, with sharp features softened only by the faintest trace of fatigue in his eyes. His brown hair was cut close to his scalp, with stubble lining his jaw. But it was his eyes, deep and piercing green, that caught her off guard. There was something in them, something different from the cold, uncaring stare she expected. Vulnerability. Pain. This was the man sent to bind with her. He looked out of place, standing there in the ceremonial space, the very antithesis of the purity it represented. And yet, as he shifted slightly under her gaze, Niara noticed something strange. Her chest tightened, her pulse quickened. Was it fear? Anger? She couldn't quite place it. She only knew that it wasn't what she expected. The high priestess began to speak, her voice calm, yet each word carried a weight that pressed down on Niara's very soul. The time has come to fulfill the grand rites, the joining of human and Ziri. The survival of our species rests upon your shoulders, Niara, daughter of the Ziri line, and you, Lieutenant Jason Cole of Earth's 9th Infantry Battalion. Bear the duty of your people. Jason. His name was Jason. Niara's fingers twitched beneath the fabric of her robe, a nervous tic she rarely exhibited. She despised this, being paraded like some sort of prize. Her sharp nails dug into her palm, the slight pain helping to keep her grounded. Yet her eyes kept drifting back to him. She didn't understand it. His presence unnerved her. He was so human. His flesh was bare in places, skin exposed to the cold chamber air, his heartbeat nearly palpable in the silence between them, matching her own chaotic rhythm. Why did he not seem like the others? Jason shifted on his feet, his boots making the faintest scuff against the polished stone floor. His face remained unreadable, but Niara sensed the tension radiating off him. He was no more willing to be here than she was. It should have been reassuring, but it only deepened her own confusion. Do you accept the rite of binding? The high priestess asked, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence became unbearable. Niara's lips parted, but her voice stuck in her throat. She didn't want this. She couldn't want this. But the consequences of refusal. Those were far worse. She glanced at Jason again, hoping to find some trace of the monster she'd been told about, the beast that supposedly lived within every human male. But he remained stoic, his gaze locked somewhere above her as if staring into a distant memory. "I accept," Niara said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The words tasted like ash. Jason hesitated longer, his jaw clenching as he inhaled deeply, eyes darkening with some unspoken thought. "I accept." The moment the words left his mouth, the air in the room seemed to shift. The crystals surrounding the altar began to glow brighter, their pulses syncing with the rapid beat of Niara's heart. She stepped forward, her legs feeling heavy, each movement a conscious effort to suppress the rising panic in her chest. Jason stood before her now, towering above her, his presence overwhelming in a way that both frightened and intrigued her. His hands, calloused and scarred, hung at his sides, fingers flexing involuntarily. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a stark contrast to the cool sterility of the chamber. It unsettled her. The high priestess began the ritual chant, her voice a low melodic hum that echoed throughout the chamber. The words were ancient, in a language long forgotten by most of their kind, but Niara understood their meaning. The binding was a sacred connection, one that transcended the physical. It was a merging of two souls, a union meant to ensure the survival of their species. But as the chant continued, Niara's mind raced. How could she possibly bond with this human? He was an outsider, a stranger, a threat, yet, as she stood before him, something in her began to unravel. The fear she had harbored for so long, the disgust, the revulsion, it was all still there, but something else was stirring beneath the surface. Jason's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw him not as the enemy. Not as the monster she had dreaded, but as a man who, like her, had been forced into a fate neither of them had chosen. The chant grew louder, the crystals vibrating with energy. Niara could feel the pull of the ritual, the invisible force drawing them together. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her body tense with anticipation. Jason's hand lifted slowly, hesitantly, and hovered just inches from her cheek, his fingers twitching as if unsure whether to complete the gesture. Niara held her breath, every fiber of her being on edge, waiting, and then, in the space of a heartbeat, his hand made contact. The warmth of his touch sent a shockwave through her, a sensation so intense it nearly took her breath away. For the first time, Niara felt something she hadn't expected. Her skin burned where Jason's fingers rested, the heat of his touch seeping into her like molten fire. Her breath caught in her throat, the sensation far more intimate than anything she had prepared for. The contact was brief, fleeting. His hand grazed her cheek, then fell back to his side, but the lingering warmth remained. She fought the urge to step back, to retreat into the safety of distance, but her body betrayed her. Her pulse quickened, her skin prickling with awareness. The high priestess urged softly, "Continue." Niara's heart raced, the words echoing in her mind, yet they felt distant, detached from the turmoil roiling inside her. She had imagined this moment countless times, how she would feel, how much she would despise him, how fiercely she would resist. But here, with him so close, she couldn't summon the anger she'd anticipated. Her mind flickered with images of human violence, their brutal wars, their world dominated by savagery. But Jason. He was different. His presence wasn't harsh or commanding. It was reserved, burdened with something unspoken. He didn't move to claim her like a primitive beast. His eyes held a quiet torment that mirrored her own. "Why are you doing this?" She whispered, her voice breaking the silence between them. "You don't want this either." Jason's green eyes locked onto hers. An unexpected intensity in them. His lips parted, but words seemed to stick in his throat, as though he struggled to find the right response. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough with emotion. "I don't have a choice." His words were blunt, but there was no anger behind them, just a weary resignation that struck a chord deep within her. For a moment, the tension in Niara's chest eased. She understood that weariness, it mirrored her own. "I don't want this," she admitted softly, almost to herself, the words escaping before she could stop them. She felt raw, vulnerable, as if voicing her truth aloud had peeled back a layer of armor she'd kept hidden for too long. Jason's gaze softened, his hardened features relaxing in a way that made her pulse stutter. There was something about him that was disarming, even comforting. He wasn't what she'd expected. The ritual required more than just understanding, the binding demanded a physical union, a connection that went beyond mere touch. Nara's heart pounded at the thought, dread settling deep within her. Could she really go through with this? Jason stepped closer, narrowing the space between them until the air crackled with tension. His shallow breaths and unwavering gaze drew her in, as though some invisible force compelled her. Despite her mind's protests, her body instinctively leaned toward him. The High Priestess spoke again, her voice firm and commanding. "You must connect. The rite demands union." Nara's throat tightened, her hands trembling as she reached out to him, her fingers grazing the rough fabric of his uniform. Beneath her touch, his chest rose and fell, anchoring her in this surreal moment. She had never been this close to a human, never touched one so personally. It felt both wrong and strangely right. Jason's eyes flickered with uncertainty as he gently placed his hands on her waist, his touch soft and cautious, as if fearing he might harm her. Warmth seeped through her ceremonial robes, sending a shiver down her spine. Nara's breath hitched as an unfamiliar heat gathered low in her belly. She didn't understand this, or him. The High Priestess's chant filled the air, thick with ancient power, as the crystals around them pulsed with an intensified glow. The binding was beginning, drawing them in. Nara felt a deep, primal urge stir within her, a force that had once driven her ancestors to seek out human mates. Despite her inner resistance, her body moved, pressing closer to Jason, her hands resting on his chest. Jason's grip on her waist tightened as his breathing quickened, his darkened eyes mirroring her own tension. She sensed his inner struggle to maintain control, which only heightened the strange connection forming between them. As the binding's energy surged through her, each sensation amplified, every touch, every breath pulling them deeper into connection. Beneath the physical pull, though, was something more, a thread of understanding that wove between them. It wasn't just the rite binding them, it was their shared predicament. They were both unwilling participants in a destiny neither had chosen. In that shared struggle, a flicker of empathy began to take root. Jason's hand slid from her waist to her lower back, pulling her even closer. Her body tingled, every nerve alive under his touch. Nara's skin burned where they touched. The binding was pushing them toward the inevitable. Then, for the first time, Jason spoke, his voice soft, almost vulnerable. "You're not what I thought." The words took her by surprise. She had expected silence, maybe even anger. But there was a raw honesty in his tone. She wasn't what he'd expected. "I'm not what I thought either," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the crystals. In that brief moment, their eyes met, and Nara felt something shift. The fear and dread that had filled her began to fade, replaced by an unfamiliar connection. She didn't want to be here, but maybe he didn't either. Their hands intertwined as the chant's final words echoed around them. The light from the crystals intensified, and Nara felt herself drawn to the ancient call. Suddenly, silence fell. The High Priestess lowered her arms, her voice fading into the stillness of the chamber. "It is done." Nara and Jason remained frozen, their hands still entwined, breathing heavily. The rite was complete, but as they looked at each other, Nara realized this was far from over. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. Jason's hand held hers firmly, his warmth seeping into her palm. His touch awakened her senses in a way she hadn't anticipated. As they stood in the wake of the binding, a deeper awareness grew. Their fates were intertwined in a way she couldn't undo. Jason's grip tightened slightly, grounding her in the present. She looked up to meet his gaze, surprised to find confusion and uncertainty there, mirroring her own. They were no longer just alien and human, they were two beings, both caught in a destiny neither had chosen. What now? She whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of dread and resignation. Jason didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted, as though searching for something in the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, strained. We survive. The simplicity of his response caught Nara off guard. Survival, was that all there was to hope for? She had been taught that the binding was sacred, the key to saving their species. But now, with the weight of the right pressing down on her, survival felt like the only thing left to hold on to. The High Priestess stepped forward, her robes whispering against the stone floor as she spoke. The rite has been completed. You are bound now, Nara and Jason of Earth. What comes next is beyond our control. At the mention of her name, Nara felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. She had known this day would come. Had prepared for it all her life. But the reality was far more overwhelming than she had anticipated. A flicker of rebellion sparked within her. Was this truly beyond her control? Was she just supposed to surrender to this fate, to bond with this stranger because tradition demanded it? Her heart pounded as a mix of fear and anger churned within her. Jason's hand slipped from hers, breaking their fragile connection. He stepped back, his jaw clenched as he stared at the ground, tension visible in every line of his posture. What are we supposed to do now? His voice was barely a growl, his frustration breaking through. We don't even know each other. He stopped, his fists clenched at his sides. The weight of the situation seemed to bear down on him just as heavily as it did on her. Nara swallowed hard, feeling the crushing reality. There was no turning back. This was her destiny, but it was also his now, whether he wanted it or not. The rite had bound them, and no resistance would change that. She took a deep breath, her body still buzzing with the aftereffects of the binding, yet a quiet resolve began to form. This was her life, her path. If survival required adaptation, then she would adapt. We figure it out, she said firmly, meeting his gaze. We're in this together now, like it or not. Jason's jaw tensed, his eyes narrowing as he considered her. The silence between them was thick with unsaid words. Slowly, he nodded. The High Priestess stepped forward once more, her hands clasped in front of her. The binding is only the beginning, she said, her voice calm but laced with a deeper meaning. Be warned, the challenges you now face will test not only your physical strength but also your resolve. You must find balance, or face ruin. Nara's heart tightened at the ominous tone in the priestess's voice. She had heard tales of failed bindings, of pairs unable to endure the intense connection, succumbing to the madness that came from resisting the rite. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Jason's eyes flickered with unease, but he held his ground, his expression steeling as the soldier in him surfaced. We'll survive, he repeated, though this time his words carried a quiet determination, as though he was reassuring himself as much as her. The High Priestess inclined her head. A faint smile forming on her lips. We shall see. Without another word, she turned and swept from the room, her robes trailing behind her like shadows. Her footsteps echoed into the distance, leaving Nara and Jason alone once more. For a long moment, neither spoke, the air thick with the tension of what had just taken place. Nara could still feel the lingering effects of the binding, the strange electric pull that seemed to draw them closer, despite their shared reluctance. Jason finally broke the silence, his voice low and rough. I didn't sign up for this. Nara's breath caught at the raw emotion in his voice, hearing his frustration, anger, and helplessness, feeling she understood more than she wanted to admit. Neither did I. Jason's gaze shot to hers, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. For a moment, his hardened exterior softened, showing a glimpse of the man beneath the soldier. Then why? Nara hesitated, the words catching in her throat. Why? Because it was her duty, her responsibility, because her people's survival depended on her. But that didn't make the weight any easier to bear. Because I have to, she finally whispered. Just like you. Jason looked at her for a long moment, his green eyes searching hers, as if trying to understand it all. Slowly, his shoulders relaxed, his fists unclenching. The tension between them seemed to ease, replaced by a quiet understanding. So we're stuck with this. Aren't we? His voice was soft, the words sounding more like a statement than a question. Nara nodded, her throat tight. Yes. Jason let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Great. Just great. A small, bitter laugh slipped from Nara's lips before she could stop it. Welcome to my world. Jason blinked, momentarily surprised by her humor, and for a brief moment, the corners of his mouth twitched in what might have been the start of a smile. But it faded as quickly as it appeared, replaced once again by the grim reality of their situation. We'll figure it out, he said after a long pause, his voice steadier now, more resolved. Nara wanted to believe him. But as the weight of the binding pressed on her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much more dangerous. The air in the chamber felt heavier as Nara and Jason stood in silence. The binding pulsed within them, a tether linking their fates, and yet beneath the surface, something darker stirred. Nara could feel it, a tremor at the edges of her mind, a subtle shift in the energy around them. She wasn't sure if it was the rite itself or something more dangerous, something primal awakening within her. Jason seemed oblivious, though tension etched his face, his green eyes darting around the ancient temple walls as if seeking answers to questions neither of them could articulate. He was still adjusting to it all, this world, the binding, her. Nara wondered how long he could bear it before the weight became too much. Her heart ached at the thought. She had never expected to feel sympathy for a human, least of all this one. He was supposed to be just a tool, a means to an end. Yet now, as she looked at him, she realized how deeply intertwined their lives had become. We need to leave this place, Jason finally said, breaking the stillness. His voice was firm, though tinged with exhaustion. Staying here will only make things worse. Nara nodded in agreement. The ancient temple, with its towering stone pillars and walls inscribed with the glyphs of her ancestors, felt more like a tomb now. It had been the site of their binding, but its significance had waned. They needed air, space, something to shake off the suffocating weight. Together, they moved toward the exit. The wide, arched doorway led them into the twilight of the alien city, its sky painted in deep purples and reds, the twin suns dipping low on the horizon. Below, the city buzzed with life, her people going about their daily routines, unaware of the monumental change that had just occurred in the temple. Nara glanced at Jason. His jaw was set, his gaze scanning the horizon as if searching for an escape. She recognized that look, the soldier's instincts kicking in, his mind already forming a survival plan. But this wasn't just about survival anymore. Something much larger was at stake, something neither of them fully understood yet. You said we'd figure it out, Nara said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her thoughts. Uncertainty lingered, but they were constrained by forces beyond their control. Jason's expression softened a bit, though a flicker of doubt flickered in his eyes. I don't know, he admitted, but we have to start somewhere. As they walked through the twisting streets, the strange alien architecture towered above them. Tall spires shimmered with bioluminescent designs, and the buildings curved and bent in ways that defied gravity. The air vibrated with a low hum of technology far more advanced than anything Jason had encountered on Earth. Despite the city's sophistication, it felt cold and detached, like a relic of a bygone era. Miara guided Jason through narrow passages and up steep stone steps until they reached the city's outskirts, where the dense forests began. The ancient trees, with their silver bark and deep purple leaves, cast long shadows in the waning light. They paused at the edge of a clearing, standing side by side, the tranquility of nature offering a brief escape from the turmoil of their thoughts. What do you know about the binding? Jason suddenly asked, his voice breaking the silence. What does it truly signify for us? Niara hesitated, her fingers brushing the soft purple grass beneath her feet. The binding was a sacred enigma even for her people, only the High Priestess and the Elders fully grasped its power. Yet she had received glimpses, stories passed through generations, warnings ingrained in their history. It's more than just a ritual, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's a fusion of souls. Once completed, it cannot be reversed. Our lives are now intertwined in ways we cannot yet perceive or comprehend. Jason's brow knitted in concern, his gaze fixed on hers. What kind of connection? Thoughts? Emotions? Pain? Pleasure? Niara's voice faltered, the weight of the truth bearing down on her. We can sense each other's presence and desires. The stronger the connection, the more perilous it becomes. Jason's eyes widened, tension tightening his jaw. He was grappling with the information, trying to reconcile this new reality with what he knew of himself. So you're saying we're linked, like telepathically on some level? Yes. Niara affirmed, but there was much more she hadn't even begun to explain. The deeper the bond, the more volatile it could be. The binding wasn't solely about survival, it was about power, and if mishandled, it could engulf them both. Jason exhaled deeply, rubbing a hand across his face. Fantastic. Just what I needed, my mind merging with an alien. His sarcasm barely concealed the fear brewing beneath the surface. Niara felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't chosen this any more than he had, but the burden weighed heavier on him. He had been pulled into her world, a realm he didn't understand, and now he was ensnared with no escape. I'm sorry, she murmured, surprised by the sincerity of her own words. Jason looked at her, his green eyes searching hers for something, answers, perhaps, or just reassurance that they weren't doomed. For the first time since their meeting, Niara recognized the vulnerability in him. Beneath the tough soldier facade, he was just as lost as she was. It's not your fault, Jason responded after a lengthy pause. His voice was soft, but there was a hint of acceptance in it. We're both in this together. They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them easing slightly. But just as Niara started to relax, a sudden surge of energy coursed through her chest, sending a shockwave of warmth radiating down her spine. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest as her body trembled with the force of the sensation. Her mind exploded with images, flashes of light, shadows shifting in the dark, and a profound, gnawing hunger that twisted within her. In an instant, Jason was beside her, his hands gripping her shoulders. Niara, what's happening? She couldn't respond, her vision blurred, her body vibrating with energy as the binding surged within her, intensifying. It felt as if her entire being was being pulled in two opposing directions, one toward Jason, the other toward something dark and ancient, something buried deep inside her. And then she sensed it, his presence in her mind, his thoughts brushing against her own. It was overwhelming and intrusive, yet there was an odd comfort in it as well. Their bond had deepened, solidified in a manner that was both frightening and exhilarating. Jason's voice broke through the haze, his grip on her shoulders anchoring her. Niara, talk to me. What's going on? She struggled to focus, to break through the dizzying whirlwind of emotions and sensations. The binding, she gasped, her voice strained. It's growing stronger, Jason's complexion drained. Stronger? How? Niara shook her head, fighting for breath. I don't know, but it feels like we're merging, our minds, our bodies, everything. Jason's hands gripped her shoulders more tightly, his expression a mixture of fear and resolve. We need to gain control. Whatever this is, we cannot allow it to dominate us. Niara nodded, her heart racing. Control was crucial, but how could they harness something so potent and unpredictable? As the last rays of the sun vanished, plunging the world into darkness, Niara sensed a shift deep within her, an awakening. The binding was not just about survival, it was about unlocking something far more significant. Power, yes, but also understanding, and perhaps even love. Yet, that realization came with a caveat: if they couldn't find equilibrium, if they couldn't learn to trust each other and wield this power together, it would ultimately destroy them. Jason's voice was steady, but his eyes blazed with intensity as he uttered the words that would determine their fate. "We will figure this out together." And for the first time since the rite began, Miara believed they might just succeed.